Hello, and as always, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever it is that you are joining us. I want to thank you for joining our Outlook 2022 Essential Geopolitics. My name is Aida Araissi. I'm the CEO of the Bilateral Chamber, and I am so excited to once again convene members of our board, esteemed former diplomats, former ambassadors to the MENA region. It's always one of our most popular programs, and I stay tuned for a very interesting, dynamic, and candid discussion with our great ambassadors. I do want to thank Willis Towers Watson for their support of our program, and I want to welcome the WTW team to the chamber. This is, again, one of our most popular programs because it always allows for a dynamic kind of analysis. Things are always changing in the MENA region, and there is nothing like experienced diplomats that that can speak candidly about what's going on. If I went into the backgrounds of each one, I would literally take up the whole hour. So let me just give you a snapshot in case any of you that are on don't know these diplomats. So the Honorable Susan Ziyeda, Dr. Susan Ziyeda, was most recently Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Arabian Peninsula. She also served as the US Ambassador to Qatar. She was Deputy Chief of Mission in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the Kingdom of Bahrain. She served as the official spokesperson at the embassy in Baghdad, and then, of course, had posts throughout the MENA region. So I want to give a special thanks to her. We also have Ambassador Deborah Jones. She served as the US Ambassador to Libya, US Ambassador to Kuwait, also served in all over the Middle East, Turkey in particular, and holds a master's in national security strategy. And so I'm looking forward to tapping her for her analysis of all the things that are going on right now with respect to Russia, Turkey, and others. We have the Honorable Doug Silliman. He is the president of the Arab Gulf Institute in Washington, D.C. If you don't know about this institute, they do really great work, great analysis on the GCC region, and I want to give special thanks to him. Of course, he served as U.S. Ambassador of Iraq, U.S. Ambassador also in Kuwait, served all over the region. He's a fellow Texan, and one of the interesting things that he's done among many is served in the Office of Counterterrorism and the Office of Soviet Union Affairs. So I look forward to hearing from him with regard, especially since Russia and the escalation in Ukraine is on everybody's mind. When we first interacted with my panel and we talked about what we were going to cover, we talked about the increase in diplomacy with respect from the UAE. We said that maybe we would cover, Turkey's visit to Saudi Arabia and the lessening of tensions between, the Gulf players, Qatar. Everything seemed to be on track. And since then, we've had drone attacks in Abu Dhabi, escalation in Yemen, and of course, this whole thing with Ukraine. So we've got a lot to talk about. Let me hand it over to you, Ambassador Ziyeda. What's going on?
Good morning. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Ida, for this opportunity and for the opportunity to be with my colleagues on this esteemed panel and the opportunity to address the participants and listeners. I wanted to start by talking a bit about the U.S. military force posture in the region, because this has been something of a discussion in terms of our commitment to the region, how we're looking at things, and where the Biden administration is going on this. So let me just give a few facts that maybe paint a broad picture. First of all, let's look at where we've drawn down, because we really are still at about 30,000 strong in the region, We have drawn down in Afghanistan, and we'll get into that a little bit later on, but the fact is that we no longer have a presence there. Obviously, we have drawn down in Iraq. In the region, in terms of bases and our large facilities there, we have closed Camp Salih, or we're drawing down in Qatar. Now, this was a large base with pre-positioned material. It's been moved to Jordan. And we have removed some Patriot anti-missile systems in Iraq, Kuwait, and the Kingdom, mostly hardware. But let me emphasize the but. We still have a robust presence in terms of number. Our headquarters for Central Command forward is still in El Udeid. AFCENT, the Air Force subcomponent of Central Command, still has a huge sprawling base in El Udeid that provides support and lift and projection of force projection capabilities in the region. And of course, our military naval component, NAVCENT, and the Fifth Fleet, which is in Bahrain, produces all of the patrolling for the critical sea lanes in and around the peninsula for the movement of goods, most notably energy. So our presence is very robust. We still have air installations in the UAE and Al Dhafra and also in Oman, and of course, a ground contingent and air in Kuwait, among others. I could go on and on, but the point is we are still very much engaged, albeit certain elements have been removed. We still are very active in foreign military sales and security cooperation. We still are doing joint military training. And as I mentioned, we still have troops on the ground there. So it's still a robust presence. That said, Saudi Arabia has improved its defense capability, as has the UAE, as we've seen by the most recent rocket attacks, where they have been able to take on the Houthi attacks and intercept using either US or US and Saudi or Emirati forces manning their missile defense capabilities. I do think, though, that it is accurate to say that these countries are looking to diversify their security relationships with other countries worldwide, and that it has been ongoing, but particularly was expedited in view of our hasty retreat from Afghanistan and in view of sort of our concerns about let me see how I can say this, sort of our passive stance to certain Iranian aggressions in the region, particularly the Abqaiq attack against Aramco a year ago. So now let's look at the region. I would say the region in general is still going through a period of sort of avoiding conflict and confrontation to the extent that they can, a period of diplomacy, some form of dialogue with adversaries. The countries are seeking self-preservation. They're pragmatic in their approach. Certainly with the signing of the Al-Ula declaration in January of 2021 ushered in a period of tremendous de-escalation in the region and a coming to terms of the GCC countries, some kind of rapprochement. Qatar weathered this embargo and diversified its economy to an extent, and certainly played very strongly on issues of serving as a mediator at times with Iran, and in particular with the Taliban account, which was so helpful to us as we evacuated our personnel and our Afghan allies in the region. So Qatar is in a unique situation. The Emir is coming to Washington next week to meet with President Biden. No doubt they will be talking the Afghanistan file and the all-important world energy and gas supplies in the face of potential Russian encroachment on Ukraine. The UAE has also taken a very pragmatic approach. They have opened up channels of communication more with Iran, with Israel, and interestingly with Turkey. The Turkey one bears watching, particularly as Turkey has opened up lines of communications also with Saudi Arabia. The economic pressures on Turkey and on the Turkish lira have forced that. And interestingly, the UAE, which has been hesitant, and had drawn kind of a line against dealing with Turkey. That line now has been blurred as the Muslim Brotherhood doesn't seem to be, it's more on the descendant in countries like Egypt and Tunisia, more relegated to pockets like in Western Libya and in Gaza. And so therefore, there's more of a confidence from the UAE that they can work with Turkey and pull them closer into the Arab orb. In terms of Saudi Arabia, there also have been talks with the Iraqis mediating between Saudi Arabia and Iran that have been taking place in Baghdad. I personally think this is more for show, and there's been less substance, but the fact that there have been discussions is still good. And the fact that more recently, 2 Iranian diplomats have reopened an office that is linked to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation in Jeddah. This is a new development. That office had been closed for about 6 years, and the Saudis have let these Iranian officials come back in and reopen that office as a show of good faith. Now, one other thing, we have to look at the relationship between Israel and Iran, and that bears watching. I think that this is also showing a bit of a gap between understandings of Emirati-Iranian relations and how the Israelis look at it. And I'm not sure the Israelis are happy with this, at least opening that the Emiratis are giving to Iran. It's noteworthy that when the Houthis attacked the Emirates, Abu Dhabi last week, with these missile attacks, Lana Nusaybi, their perm rep at the UN, in making her statement, talked about the Houthi attack and talked about it as a terrorist attack. But nowhere did she mention Iran specifically. And that was noteworthy because in the past that would have been expected. And my last points on Saudi Arabia, other than their opening in terms of talks with Iran, talks with Turkey, a greater rapprochement with Qatar. Probably Qatar has better relations now with Saudi Arabia, more so than, let's say, with Bahrain or even the UAE, although those are improving, is the fact that internally Saudi Arabia is going through tremendous change, a more centralization of power within the royal family, and a sidelining of some of the traditional centers of power, like the religious leadership and the mercantile class that has long had relationships with certain patrons within the royal family. So this has been a diminution of their position and the growth of youth as a font of support based on the liberalization and cultural openings that the Crown Prince has ushered into Saudi Arabia in these past few years. So I'll stop there and turn it over to my colleagues and look forward to questions.
Thanking you, Ambassador Ziada, because you really gave us a really great overview, and each one of those could take us in a different direction. So before I get to the Q&A part, Ambassador Jones, your thoughts, particularly on Libya, Turkey, whichever you want to take on first.
Right, let me go in kind of alphabetical order, and let me start with Kuwait, just because Susan touched on that there. And I do want to say that you know, Kuwait is very unique in the region. It's kind of an outlier in the Gulf states, as we can see, because it is the only place with a functioning, well, or dysfunctioning, as one looks at it, parliament that actually has actual powers to question the leadership, to prevent bills, to pass legislation, to prevent legislation. For that reason, we see high turnover in governance. But what I wanted to say in general terms, Kuwait still, it's having growing pains and issues. As we all know, everyone saw the article of, you know, Kuwait, is it becoming too hot to live there, et cetera, et cetera. There is frustration with Kuwaitis, as always, with the slow pace of governance. I'm sure this sounds familiar to many Americans. The fact that the parliament seems to be an impediment more than an aid to getting anything done. At the same time, they remain very wedded to their system and very proud of the fact that they do have this consensual arrangement and relationship between the ruling class and the ruled, and certainly the role of the merchant families has become a little more complicated in all of this as well. But I do want to, just to tag on to what Susan had said, I do want to remind people that the United States actually owns Arifjan. Camp Arifjan was given to the United States by Sheikh Yabir following the liberation of Kuwait. But we also need to remember that that liberation was 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago. And there is a growing, there is not the same sense, let me say this, of gratitude on the hearts of young Kuwaitis. They don't have memories of that. There is still a close relationship, but it is not. In fact, I know pretty firsthand, some of the current leadership has said, France and Belgium and other European countries who were liberated by the United States during World War II have been able to go their individual ways and make their own decisions. And Kuwait should have that same capacity as well. They have a relationship with China. We are not discussing China per se here, but I think we can all agree that China has been for a while an important economic force in these countries, and will continue to be there, even as our US government was decrying Huawei several years ago. I think all of us who've traveled in the region know that the first thing you see on your telephone when you land in an airport there is links to Huawei, that that these guys are all plugged in with the Chinese pretty well. But where Kuwait continues to play a very interesting and important role, and this is interesting, I think, in the sense that Kuwait has always been somewhat independent of the rest of the GCC in relationship with Oman. We're not discussing Oman today, but the relationship between the previous emir and the Sultan of Oman was very important to creating a kind of balance and a different perspective, more traditional, consultative, and more of a less confrontational, but more of a traditional way of getting along with your enemies in the region. And Kuwait still continues to play that role, though, most recently with the travel of the foreign minister to Lebanon, where he again advised the Lebanese to stop, and I think met with Michel Aoun and others to be careful about inviting foreign powers in to influence their politics. Obviously, a clear talk about Hezbollah there, but at the same time, working on consolidating support for Lebanon throughout the GCC states after there were some pretty difficult moments and unhappiness with some of the comments coming out of certain officials in Lebanon about what was going on elsewhere. I would also say that kind of further to what Susan said, I mean, those of us who've worked in the region know that these countries have always, because of where they live and the neighborhood where they live, they've had to have relationships that are quite transactional in nature and pragmatic in whether it's with Iran, whether it's with other countries throughout the region. And the Kuwaitis are perhaps as skilled as anyone in managing those relationships and kind of juggling in the balance. Obviously, they went through the economic period. They've always been rather frugal. They've had challenges, but the Kuwaitis traditionally had based their budget on oil at $50 a barrel. When it goes up, they've been having recent problems, and some of those might be mitigated a little bit by the current spike in Brent prices, but their biggest problem has been that their parliament would not approve borrowing on the part of the government to pay off some of their debt. And this has been a real source of concern to Kuwait, because it's kind of held them in a tight space as governance. But again, with respect to all three of these countries and probably everyone that we're talking about, I think it's important to remember that good governance relies on the provision of security, rule of law, and equitable, not equal, access to national wealth. I think that applies everywhere. And so a lot of the dynamics we're seeing in these places gets back to these issues. And on that note, I will segue into the opposite, into Libya. The one thing that Libya and Kuwait have in common is oil. And that's probably the last thing that they have in common. They both are tribal as well, but the Kuwaiti ruling family has managed to work with its tribes in ways that have induced them to support or go along with programs or provided them inducements to support the nation per se. Libya, I'm sorry to say, because I have a tremendous respect for Stephanie Williams and for the work that she's been doing and for her great efforts to bring about a political solution to the problem in Libya. Libya's biggest problem is probably that, contrary to kind of the rules again of sovereign states, Libya has been unable to have a dominant security force in that country, with all the militias. And one of the basic rules of a state, of a stable state, is that the government has a monopoly on the use of force. And clearly that's not the case in Libya. The other problem is that they're looking for a political solution when, in fact, and I think Marina Ottaway pointed this out very well several weeks ago, they have no political parties or systems per se, because Gaddafi established a very interesting system to kind of divide and conquer, again, using tribal relationships, the relationships between urban Libyans and people out in the hinterland, the nomadic Libyans, to keep them both in part apart from each other, but also feeling individually empowered. So you have this anomaly where there's no real political structure, there are no real political institutions per se. There are two institutions that continue and have had their problems, but still, it's important to note that the central bank and the National Oil Company have kept functioning. And it has been a goal of ours to keep those functioning as well. But it should also tell us something, the fact that the Libyans really haven't tried to destroy them per se, because every Libyan is benefiting from them right now, even though there is no political institution capable of governance there. Libyans are very, very good at elections. They've had them several times. They like elections. Again, with respect to the work of the UN, I have often said that having elections, electing a new government without having a constitutional base or any kind of clear delineation of power is like filling the nib on a fountain pen that has no bladder to hold the ink and no handle to hold the nib. So you can change out people all you like, but if you don't have clear lines of authority or clear powers in that government, you're not going to get any place. And I noticed that recently, despite all the talk about this political process and establishing, transitional justice, national reconciliation, and having and creating the legitimacy for a constitutional process, which has been tried before, after this very active meeting with everyone, and anyone who follows Stephanie Williams' moves wonders. I mean, she's the Energizer bunny on steroids. Yesterday they held a demonstration with the by the current prime minister, and completely opposed to having elections absent a constitutional process. And so despite all the talk, we're going to end up in the same place we've been for the last 10 years, which is squabbling militias who are very unhappy because they don't have confidence in the government's ability to distribute national wealth. They want their share of it. They're getting a share of it right now. It's hard to persuade people to switch to a system when they don't see what they're going to get out of it. And as far as I can see, the goal of most Libyans who've been in politics, and this is going to sound very cynical, but is to retain their seats for as long as they can. And maybe that also sounds familiar to Americans. The problem for business in Libya right now, despite all that oil money and the revenues, as long as it keeps flowing, and the NOC has been able to try to keep it, Mustafa Sanala deserves a medal, but there's no ability to commit to big projects. And I think everyone who's tried to do business there has seen that no one has the authority to say, great, we'll start on this project, you'll get paid, you'll do whatever. So that's my quick and dirty. I'm not very optimistic about Libya right now, because I don't see a willingness to concede power. And I don't see people want to see, they do want elections. We're constantly reminded there are 2.5 million registered voters there, which is a high percentage, but you can have the election again, but toward what end? I keep saying, and maybe Stephanie's right. If you can bring about the legitimacy that allows them to move in other directions, that'd be grand. But that conflict remains there. Proxy of powers are there. Yes, Turkey went in openly and with the approval of its parliament. Turkey has long roots there. This whole thing is going to be debated forever. But let me move to Turkey though, because I think Libya kind of has underscored the whole NATO piece and things that are going to influence now as we confront Russia, as the Ukraine and Russia piece goes forward, all of this stuff is going to come to the forefront. I'm going too quickly, I know, for a lot of people. Turkey is in an interesting place now, whether this was driven by the economic situation or what have you. You know, the visit of Erdogan, the visit of Mohammed bin Zayed to Istanbul, you know, talks about supporting Turkey, getting money back in. Of course, the Gulf states have had investment in Turkey for a long time, including in some very prominent hotels, which I'm sure many of you have stayed at while you've been to Istanbul. If you haven't, you should. But the fact is, Erdogan who remains, by the way, still very popular in Turkey. Whatever people want to believe, he still remains popular. Turks also, I think you have to see Turkey from a historic perspective as well. Same way I think you have to see Putin in a historic perspective, or when you talk about Iraq later on, doesn't matter whether you're Saddam or someone later, you resent the fact that the shot is cut off to you. You know, Turkey still, any Turk asks them about the Treaty of Lausanne, which most of us never think about twice, but that's the 1923 end of World War I that redrew the lines of Turkey. They feel that they have been restrained. They are trying to flex their regional muscles again, the way that Russia and others are. And from the Turkish perspective, and if you think about them as a NATO power in Article 5, when they had a coup attempt against the government in July of 2016, what they saw from the West was not support. They saw a sort of Schadenfreude, or a sort of anticipatory waiting to see what would happen there. And that has had a deep psychological impact on many Turks, together with the EU's resistance to having Turkish entry, especially from the French. And we see those divisions still right now. But we also see that Erdogan remarkably said not too long ago that Israel was, quote, essential to Middle Eastern security. I mean, a tune that is changing. There are things that are reaching out now. I think that we're going to see that in 2022, some of these chips are going to fall into place, where Turkey is reaching out, where it's receiving, where it's income, you know, inputs from from countries with whom it had hostile relationships. I think we're going to see in its relationships with Armenia, other places, you're going to see a different Turkey that is reaching out. In part, this may be because people do feel that the United States has withdrawn a little bit, or that they have some room. Obviously, the S-400 issue remains an issue. However, Turks will remind you that those have not been deployed, and they are still in a natural competition with Russia elsewhere. So these are the curious dynamics we're seeing around the world right now. They're still very unhappy about being denied F-35s. They will tell you that, you know, they didn't get a good deal from Raytheon, and that's why they had to go to the S-400s. And I think people need to look at that also in the context of the coup attempt, and feeling that they would go to Russia. It was kind of a poke, a jab in the eye to the West on that point. But I think that we're going to see increasing and amelioration of relations out externally. We have a difficult time sometimes understanding that people live in a region and they have regional interests that may not make sense to us. For us, our affiliation with Syria, with the Kurds in Syria, was a tactical necessity to defeat ISIS. The Turkish saw that as adopting allowing the tactical to become a strategic relationship that somehow trumped our relationship with Turkey. Again, two sides of this story, but I'm going to open up all these cans of worms and then dump them on Doug to talk about now. Thank you.
Fantastic. And we're all drinking from the fire hose from all of your collective, experiences. Doug, your thoughts? Jump in.
Aida, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be back talking to the Bilateral Chamber and your group, and really a pleasure to have my two friends, Deborah and Susan, here with me to help explain what's going on in the Middle East, because it requires a whole army to explain what's going on. I'm going to talk quickly about Iraq, a little bit about the UAE, a glancing blow at Saudi Arabia, and then a little bit more about the general atmosphere in the region, rounding back to where Susan started about half an hour ago. First on Iraq, there is As we noted before we started this conversation, that there's not a lot of news coming out of Iraq. I think that's basically a good thing. And there's the potential for good news coming out of Iraq, and let me explain that. Street protests in Iraq in 18, 19, and 20 forced the parliament to change Iraq's electoral law. It forced early elections, which were held last October. And the results of those elections gave, for those US officials and others who've worked in Iraq, Muqtada Sadr, who is a very anti-American sort of firebrand preacher, has put him in the driver's seat to form a new government. What is interesting about this is that he has pledged publicly to form, for the first time since the US intervention in 2003, a majority government. In other words, what a parliamentary system should look like. Political parties gather together, they gather around some sort of political platform, and when they get a majority of seats in the parliament, they elect a prime minister and a government. That has not happened in Iraq since 2003, and this seems to be the goal that Sadr is aiming toward right now. He's aiming to do this largely by trying to exclude the most virulent and pro-Iranian militia forces and their political parties from the government, which in my view is a good thing. And frankly, having Iraqis look toward the possibility of a series of majority governments in the future after elections will change the calculus underneath. Now, none of this has happened yet. It is possible that if the pro-Iranian factions, especially aligned to militias, don't get in the government, there could be violence and instability. It is possible, however, that this process and Sadr's insistence on a majority government, not a consensus government, could change Iraqis' approach to democracy and to the idea of governance itself. Big picture items, but right now, the next 3 or 4 months could show whether this is going to happen sooner than later or later than later. At the same time, I will say that the current Prime Minister of Iraq, Mustafa Kadhimi, has really put Iraq in a new position in the region. As I think Deborah mentioned, or Susan mentioned, he has sponsored talks between Saudi Arabia and Iran. While not really important for Saudi Arabia and Iran, other than the process, it puts Iraq in a different light. He hosted a summit meeting, including Emmanuel Macron, the French president, and brought together leaders of the entire region in Baghdad. And he is trying very hard to work with the GCC, and they've just recently signed an agreement with the Saudis to integrate the power grids between Saudi Arabia. One with Kuwait may or may not be happening in the near term because of Kuwaiti politics. On the downside in Iraq, there has been a huge increase in ISIS attacks, not necessarily because the United States is gone, but I think ISIS sees opportunities with what it sees as a smaller US presence and exploiting the seams, literal seams in defenses between the Iraqi army, the Kurdish Peshmerga, and the Popular Mobilization Front militias. So watch this space. You saw a major attempt at a jailbreak of ISIS fighters in Syria this past week. There is still a military siege going on. So the ISIS chapter is not yet closed, even though I and others in 2017 declared ISIS defeated as a state controlling territory in Iraq. Let me switch quickly to the UAE. There's a lot going on in the UAE. And as Susan earlier mentioned, from 2014, 2015, the UAE was in a very expansionist position. They were engaging in Libya, in East Africa. They were investing in China. They were investing in India. They had a couple of real spats with Qatar that ended in 2017 with an embargo of Qatar by most of the GCC. I think that in particular COVID, but perhaps the reputational cost and the actual cost of all of this intervention has caused them to look a bit more inward and to try to figure out where is the UAE going. So what you can see in the past couple of years has been a consolidation of their gains. They went after and got one of the rotating seats on the UN Security Council, which they now occupy for the next 2 years. And they have been trying to essentially create a new social contract inside the UAE, which is unlike anything else in the region. They're trying to provide for a country that has 90% of its population expatriates, greater involvement of that population in Emirati success. And for those at the top end of that scale, at least, of the expatriates, giving them the possibility of full Emirati citizenship and a way to keep the personal gains that people have made with under the Emirates. They've reconciled with Qatar, with Turkey to some extent. They have signed an agreement with Israel. We can talk about that a little bit later as well. But they have continued to be allied to their key Gulf allies. And the Emirates was attacked last week by the Houthis, certainly with Iranian equipment, although potentially under, but not necessarily under Iranian direction. This is tied to Yemen, and if anybody wants to do a deep dive in Yemen, we can do that in the Q&A. But the Saudis and the Emiratis moved some forces around in Yemen and put the Houthi forces on their back feet in the past couple of months, which drew the ire of the Houthis and to some extent the Iranians. Quickly on Saudi Arabia, there's a lot of good that's happening in Saudi Arabia that no one ever talks about. You hear about civilian casualties in the war in Yemen, a lot of talk about sort of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in 2018. The Saudis have a lot to answer for, but one of the things that Mohammed bin Salman is trying to do as a de facto ruler is completely revive and change Saudi society, focusing on a more gender-neutral society and one that provides more equal opportunities for Saudis inside the country. There's a lot going on internally in Saudi Arabia, which will affect the business climate, but it will also provide a lot of significant opportunities for business and new kinds of projects. I want to finish, however, on what I see as the biggest issue, probably in the entire Middle East and certainly in the Gulf, and that is the growing perception among the governments and peoples in the Middle East and the Gulf of multipolarity, that the United States is no longer the single dominant player in the Middle East or the Gulf. The focus of most of this discussion is China, and China has obviously had great success penetrating the commercial markets of the Gulf and the Middle East. In much of the Middle East, that focus, or in East Africa, that focus has been on the Belt and Road Initiative and Chinese investment in infrastructure. For the Gulf, the focus has been the digital Silk Road. It is trying to sell Chinese high-tech equipment and China's advantage in high-tech over probably better but higher cost American and European alternatives. But China has a very interesting view of the Gulf in particular. They want to have equally good relations with Saudi Arabia and Iran as the two economic anchors of their policy in the Gulf. This is going to be very difficult for them to achieve, and I'm not sure that they understand the difficulty quite yet. They seem to be inching toward a security role in the region, and they have a naval base in Djibouti and actually kicked DP World ports out of the port facilities in Djibouti a couple of years ago. They've established what looked to have been a small military presence in Abu Dhabi that ended up blocking the F-35 sale, but they do not yet have the capability to secure the supply lines and the trade routes from the Gulf to China, and will be willing to depend upon the United States and other international actors to do that. What I think is maybe most interesting, though, is that while China is not really selling this, a lot of people in the Middle East are looking at China and looking at the United States and saying the Chinese political model of economic growth with political stability, regardless of how that happens, is really something that is attractive to us, as opposed to this messy democracy that the United States and Europe practice, especially now if you look at political disarray in the United States, inability of governments to do things concretely and quickly, not only in the US, but also in a lot of places in Europe. So there is, if you will, an ideological struggle that really neither the United States or China are directly engaged in, but a change in perception in some of the countries in the Gulf. Quickly on Russia. Russia is going to be a major player in the Middle East, if only because it remains a member of OPEC Plus, and will have a significant impact on the future of oil markets. A Ukraine invasion will make things more difficult, but it does not reduce the power of the number of barrels that Russia can put on the market every day. And in the Middle East and in the Gulf, the Russians will continue to try to fill vacuums left where there is not an American or other outside presence. Syria is the one that I've looked at the most. Libya is probably an example of this, but I think you continue to see Russia meddling in the region, although probably not getting as strong a foothold as they once had. What is probably most interesting for Americans is the challenge from European countries. I mentioned that Emmanuel Macron went to Baghdad for a regional summit. He was the only Westerner invited to that conclave. And as you can see now with President Macron and the new Chancellor of Germany, Scholz, they seem to be trying to develop a separate European security strategy to deal with Russia and Ukraine. But that same may also be true in the rest of the region. On the defense side, the French have just made a big sale of Rafale jets to the Emiratis. You've seen a lot of commercial penetration in the defense area as well. Other airplanes, lower models, and helicopters. On energy, ENI and Total have been going after a lot of different energy deals in the region, particularly in the north in Iraq, more aggressively than in the past. And I think that you will see a continued more aggressive and more independent European foreign policy and economic policy, particularly in the Gulf, where there's a lot of money to be made. And then I will note, multipolarity is not just the global players like France, Russia, and China. It also the regional players, Turkey, Israel, India. And I just don't have time to cover them, but if people have questions, we can certainly talk about that. So Aida, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you very much. I've got a lot of questions to ask you, and I have one right off the bat that I'd like everybody to weigh in on. As I said, today what's on everybody's mind is this growing tension between NATO and Russia and us possibly sending more US troops. How do the regional countries that you've touched upon, what is their stance on this? Maybe I take it to Deborah vis-a-vis Kuwait, and then each of you can weigh in. Are they keeping out of this?
That's been the dog that hasn't barked right now, as far as I can see. I did a quick Google search of that to see if there had been any cheap or comment out of any of the GCC countries on this, and I didn't find anything. Maybe someone else saw something. Obviously, as I say, I don't know enough about the plans right now, and I know we have the ground forces and where they're going to go. I suspect that, again, we own RF John, but and we still use other air bases in Kuwait, but I don't know that there has been any conversation about beefing up presence or anything else, because in part, sometimes the attitude of the Kuwaitis is they don't want to hear what they don't need to hear. I mean, plausible deniability is a great position to have when it comes to US military plans, but I have not seen any public statements, nor even from Turkey. And I see that Doug wants to say something now. Please, sorry.
Yes.
What I was going to say is I think Deborah is right, is that the countries of the Gulf are not really focusing on Ukraine. And frankly, it could affect them very deeply if it goes forward. I don't think they're looking at what might happen to international oil markets, the pressure that will be put on Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait in particular to increase oil production to make up for whatever sanctions might be imposed upon Russia. I kind of think they're hoping that nothing bad happens so they don't have to deal with it. There have been discussions between US officials and Gulf officials about what might happen in the oil markets, but I don't think they've gotten very concrete yet. And I'm pretty sure that those in the Gulf don't yet want to have to deal with those possibilities.
Doug, can I just say quickly,
and
I think there was some conversation with Qatar about gas.
I wanted to jump in on that, if I may.
Sorry, go ahead, Susan. Yeah.
No, thank you very much. Actually, one of the things that will be on the agenda with the Emir when he comes in, talks to President Biden, will be the issue of gas supplies. Now, Qatar does supply a small amount on spot markets of their liquefied natural gas, but it's not enough to make a dent on the needs in Europe, and there are real fears. I think the Americans are going to try and see if there can be put some pressure to bear to have the Qataris reroute some of the supplies that have traditionally gone to their Asian markets. In Asia, they have long-term contracts, and those contracts have served the Qataris well because A, they're usually negotiated at a higher price point, and B, for a longer period of time. And ever since, in particular, with the Fukushima disaster in Japan in 2011, those contracts have been sought by Asian countries, Japan and South Korea, for their industrial bases. So when that happened in 2011, the Qataris had to talk to the Europeans who they were supplying at that time to release some supplies to Asia. It will be interesting to see now if Asia is ready to return the favor and released a little bit of that supply for Qatar to supply to the north. They already do supply places like the UK. They have a regasification facility in the southern part of Great Britain. But this issue is definitely going to be one where the US is looking for all supplies worldwide. And I think they're starting with Qatar.
So, you're all plugged in with the current officials at the administration, and there has been a disengagement that we've been hearing from the energy companies on anything related to fossil fuels. We just convened in Houston the World Petroleum Congress, and there was nobody of note that attended that. That doesn't seem to be a real policy. And yet here we are again with energy at the core of so much of even a foreign policy. What do any of you, have you had interactions with anyone at the Biden administration regarding if they're going to value again sort of the contributions of the energy industry to our interests?
I mean, I can take that on a little bit. There has been a clear shift, and I think the shift is mostly clear because of the significant change between the Trump administration and the Biden administration on climate change and energy policy, with obviously a clear preference of Biden officials to, if you will, make up for the time that they see was lost during the Trump administration in terms of dealing with climate change. I have noticed in my informal talks with friends that there is a realization that, yes, net zero is coming at some point in the future, peak oil is coming at some point in the future, but in the interim, there may need to be some investment in legacy hydrocarbons, is what some people might call them, particularly natural gas, to make sure that there is a flexible and available supply of oil and gas for the markets. I don't think this has reached the level of US policy yet, but I know that some of my colleagues in the Gulf are thinking about this. There are people in Asia thinking about this. So the huge contraction during coronavirus in 2020, and now the huge expansion of fossil fuel needs and the increase in prices, particularly in Europe, has caused a lot of people to determine or to ask, have we been investing enough upstream and midstream for the past decade while all the money has been chasing renewables? So again, nothing clear, but that's sort of the tenor of what I hear.
May I jump in, Ida, on this one, please, as well? The whole issue of gas supplies. Now, Qatar is expanding its North Field operations so that in 2026, they'll be able to go from 77 million tons per annum to 111 million tons per annum. Interestingly, Saudi Arabia, which for the longest time has not been able to really produce non-associated gas, is now number 6 in the world in production in 2020 for the production of non-associated gas supplies. Now, they haven't started exporting, they're using it for domestic, but they're looking to export in the future. And the other thing that I would mention, so there is a definite focus on investment and expansion, at least in natural gas in our GCC states. The other thing from a US perspective, I noticed that our envoy on energy, Amos Hochstein, is in Lebanon now, or in Israel. But what he's doing is trying to, again, work on the maritime border between the two countries. Yes, it's important from a security perspective, but particularly because there is a gas, the potential for gas production in those fields, and looking how to bring that gas production online. Over.
Yeah, thank you. And I just wanted to say that I do know that Amos Hochstein, who I think we all know, I think that in fact he has very quietly, and so I'm a little surprised, maybe Ida, he hasn't spoken to your group openly, but I think he has in fact over the last 6 to 8 weeks been engaged in quiet conversation with energy producers throughout Europe and the Middle East, North Africa and Asia. So I think, I don't think it's a matter of not doing something. I think that they are at this moment, it's kind of been going on under the, laying something out. But, who knows? But I think that he hasn't been very public, but he has been working on it. So
very good. Yeah, no, we know him well, and hopefully, I just saw the announcement that the Secretary of Energy is planning to attend the March conference, the energy conference called CIRA. So we only have a few minutes, and we didn't talk about democracy and particularly vis-a-vis Tunisia. I know that's its own. That's its own subject. So any comments from any of you regarding whether or not we're seeing, are we going to support the new government in Tunisia? Are we are we still analyzing whether or not it was a coup? Where are we at with that?
I'm sure that others know more than I do. I only know about this more from my work with Ahmed East, that I chair the board of. And I do know that things were kind of cut off, grant programs. The US government stepped back while they're assessing still what has gone on here. And to be honest, who was behind or who has funded, who has influenced what happened in Tunisia, and some of the signs are pointing back to the Arabian Peninsula. Let me just say that and leave it at that. But I don't know that I don't know that we have a clear idea yet on where that's going to go, because I think it's too soon in the process to see. But my own view on that is that there was great frustration, obviously, in Tunisia. We haven't talked about things that impact, for example, on Turkey, the economy, refugees. Turkey has taken in more refugees per capita than any other country in the world, and that affects Libya as well. But COVID impacts, and the failure of governments to deal carefully with that led to a lot of frustration. The economy and COVID led to problems in Tunisia as well. So we'll have to see where that ends. But I think back to what Doug was saying, this sense, whether true or not, that more efficient authoritarianism, kind of soft authoritarianism, is what's needed right now. Many people seem to believe that. And so we'll see where that goes.
5 minutes left. Maybe a rapid fire sort of concluding remarks by each one of you. Can we start with Doug?
Thanks, Aida. Again, thank you for giving me the opportunity to do this. I think that for especially businesses who want to work in the Middle East, there are significant social and economic changes going in the Middle East. The Gulf is finally beginning to realize that they have to adapt to a new economy. COVID helped push them along. Right now, the Emiratis are probably a decade ahead of anybody else, but the Saudis have now decided they want to catch up. You will see competition between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, but it's not the sort of US-Soviet Union competition you saw during the Cold War. It may be both countries trying to outpace each other in giving incentives and opportunities for investment or business opportunities. So I want your people not to be disturbed by potential competition, but rather see how they might be able to use that to find niches in one country or the other that they are able to fill. And I'm generally optimistic that this is going to move in a positive direction.
Great. Susan?
I would agree with what Doug said in terms of the competition between Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, except I might just say that I think there is a bit of competition that maybe is linked to other lingering issues that have not been resolved between the two countries. And sometimes when those issues are sort of put aside because they're too difficult to solve, it does come out in other ways. And the economic competition and who is ascendant in the region and who will transition more fitfully in terms of a new economic paradigm, I think is going to be very important. I think it was instructive watching how Qatar has worked the whole issue of the embargo and how they came out in pretty good shape, relatively speaking, and that could be instructive to other countries. The one thing I do want to touch on, and this maybe isn't so much of interest to the business community, but I think it speaks to the whole region. The Gulf has historically had a lot of interest in the Levant. and has had a lot of support for the Levant. I thought it was very interesting. Yes, I saw that the Kuwaiti foreign minister was recently in Beirut. The Qataris have had representation in Beirut as well, trying to play a role. But the withdrawal of the Saudis from that, and the Emiratis have not played much of a role, is very instructive in terms of where they see their priorities. And then the rapprochement with Syria, where several of these countries, notably the UAE and Oman and Bahrain, have now let's at least come to terms with the Assad regime and willing to work with it going forward. These trends, I think, are very important, looking at the Levant in terms of refugees and instability and movement of peoples, because that all will trickle down to the Gulf. So I don't think there's any escaping that. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Deborah, last words.
Okay, I'm going to offer a positive and a big question mark too. I do think that the phrase for everything we're watching is regional recalibration. I think we're seeing that big time between the countries as the other powers, especially as the US is not seen to be so directive. And as we have said ourselves, we're going to be more in a listening mode, I think, than a directive mode, what have you. So they are going to work out their own relationships in other ways. And so we are going to see that recalibration based on necessity and observation, as Susan said, of what they've seen has worked or not worked elsewhere. At the same time, I think we have not spoken a lot about potential disruptors here. We have not talked about social media and its disruptive force. So in other words, proxy engagement is going on in very disruptive ways with non-state actors also as well, using social media. Some state actors possibly using that. You just saw in Libya, they just shut down, Facebook just shut down many accounts, over 1 million bots who were working out of Turkey, but not necessarily from the government of Turkey, but elsewhere. Also, I think disruptors is drones and arms sales, mini submarines. Turkey's playing around in this area, getting involved in that. That throws in an element of uncertainty when state actors, smaller state actors, get their hands on these weapons that can be, as we've seen, deployed with deathly results elsewhere, and without probably even full consideration of the consequences of that. But I would say overall regional recalibration, and we'll hope that people are more interested in improving work opportunities, the environment. We're frightened a little by COVID, and that it moves us in a better direction. On a positive note, let's hope for that.
Thank you all very much. And Deborah, yes, it escaped me that you chair the board of Ahmed East. Groups like Ahmed East and the Arab Gulf Institute, touch on these subjects almost on a daily basis. So we do encourage people to look further into the organizations and look further into these topics. Thank you all very much for joining, and let's do this again very soon. I know we didn't talk about Algeria, Morocco, Egypt. We didn't talk much about Iran or Oman. And we didn't talk about the Levant at all. We got plenty to talk about next time. So thank you again, and wishing you all my very best.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you all.